Editors and art directors and publishing houses want to feel like they're buying fine art from you, and we sometimes forget this in our quest for the good cartoon or the good drawing. We forget that we're really in the business of creating fine art for children's publishing. Children's books are a child's introduction to fine art often, as well as literature, and editors, art directors, agents, they know this, but we sometimes forget because we get, as creators of the pictures, we get sometimes carried away with our drawing and our cute characters. We forget that we're making art, fine art. So the most surefire way to bring fine art back into your conversation with yourself is to remember those very simple elements and principles of design. So we're going to be talking about that tonight. This quote was mentioned by Frederick, Mr. Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the documentary, caught my attention because it feels right when we're talking about design. Because what composition and design are all about are invisible helpers, invisible guides. We don't see them at first when we're looking at a piece of illustration art, but if we had X-ray vision, maybe we could see them. So we'll talk about those. People don't talk about these enough, I don't think. Andrew Loomis was an illustrator in the 1950s in the United States. He's actually from my hometown of Syracuse, New York. He was a prolific commercial illustrator, commercial artist, we called them then, I guess, as well as a terrific teacher. And he wrote several textbooks that go in and out of print. They're back in print now. They're wonderful. This first diagram is from his textbook, not in his textbook. It's my drawing of something in his textbook about design. Now, when we're talking about composition and design, we're talking about kind of an invisible grid and how you're carving up the picture space for the viewer to have the best experience of your statement and your expression. So Andrew Loomis was saying he started a lot of his pictures with this kind of grid. Here's his frame, very sloppily drawn by me, and he starts by making a vertical line anywhere in the space. Vertical. He's carving up the space now to be the underlying framework skeleton of his pictorial space divisions that are going to be his composition. He goes to one of the corners of the picture and he takes it all the way down to the other. Of course, that crosses the vertical line he made. Then he goes for a horizontal. He takes the horizontal line through the intersection of the first vertical line and the diagonal that crossed it. And he then does a horizontal right at that intersection. Then he looks for any rectangles in the shapes and space partitions he's just created with those, how many lines is that? The 3 lines intersecting in the space, isn't it? And he draws a diagonal, a single diagonal in each of the rectangles. This is a rectangle. He's got a diagonal in it. And he sees a rectangle here and he makes a diagonal there. And then he draws horizontals through the intersections of any of those diagonals that he's found. So he's got one here, he's got one here, and he's got one here. This is the first one he drew. Yeah, there that is. So he's drawing one here and he's drawing one across the space here. Now we can go in, he says, and begin to lay his picture elements around these lines. That's just one way. He says you can also take your blank page and just cross a set of lines, 2 or more. And then you sort of think of the shapes and the directions and things happening, the flow of your picture with using those lines as guidelines. And these are curving lines. All of these are examples of informal design, relaxed, easy design. You can see he's got these 2 lines crossed here, and he imagines a figure kind of following that flow, and this horizontal, this curvy horizontal is a hilly landscape behind the subject, the figure. This one here, he's got a tree. figures. This line is showing the hill behind them, and this is showing the foreground land contour that they're walking up to. And he kind of put his figures right inside here, contain them. So the lines can be anything. They don't have to be human subjects. They can be, props, architecture, trees. Here's a figure, this line, sitting on maybe a bed, or it looks like a four-poster bed or something. Two fishes playing. Okay, you get the idea. So just crossing lines on the page. You can also use letters of the alphabet. They started off as pictographs anyway, originally, back in Phoenician times or before. So look at all the imagery you can conjure from our simple alphabet lines. See the X here with the farmer and the rake. L. C, formed by the horizon, the townscape, and then the tree arching over the figure. So the figure is not actually in the C shape, but the background elements that frame him they do form the C shape. Or you can use geometric forms, which starts to move in the direction of more formal design. But particularly the triangle is a big, you see it over and over again. And you'll notice this illustration has a little bit of a dated feel, 1950s, 1960s. It is very formal. Andrew Loomis was from that old school of illustrators before photography took over the magazine publishing world. And television took full hold over our culture. And we began to get used to seeing video and photographic images rather than drawn images. But for years, we were used to seeing ads that were hand painted by someone. You see all the geometric shapes. Okay, so you can also use the Fibonacci spiral, which is based on the golden ratio number, 1.618. So we've gone in here and we started with a rectangle with our frame, and then we carved up the frame by 0.618 with this line here, or a little more than half, for an asymmetrical space division. But now we had another golden rectangle inside of it created by this space division. And then he went vertically and he went a little more than half, or 0.618 ... space division, and drew his horizontal here, and that was his next space division, which created yet another golden rectangle right here, horizontal. And then he went this way a little more than half and had his space division line, which created another little golden rectangle inside of it. So these are fractal shapes that keep, if you divide them by 0.618, or multiply them rather by 0.618, you will get another fractal shape with exactly the same proportions. And you keep doing that until it's too small to really draw comfortably anymore. And then you start drawing your curved spiral from one corner of the rectangle, the golden rectangle, to the next corner of the golden rectangle. And that's how you get your proportionate, your Fibonacci spiral shape, which is a proportion we see all over the place in nature and in the spiral arms of spiral galaxies, Nautilus conch shells, and things like that. You can spend 6 months reading about the golden section and golden rectangles, golden proportion online. The ratio of 1 to 1.618 is often called the golden ratio. And it's actually a numerical, mathematical statement of the definition that Plato apparently gave beauty. This is Plato's definition of beauty: unity plus variety. The unity is challenged by the variety, which is the smaller portion of the rectangle. what you might have in your iPhone camera, a little grid in the viewfinder, the photographer's rule of thirds. It's just yet another way of looking at space and carving up the space in 2D framed view. So here's the tic-tac-toe board, 9 squares, and the trick is not so much to get something inside one of the squares, rather it's to have your focal point or your main picture element, the thing you want us to look at, subject of the composition, right in the crosshairs, right in one of the intersections of those squares, as you see the little house there. And if you look at the rule of thirds imposed over a Fibonacci spiral, you see they dovetail quite nicely. They kind of do the same thing. That blue line that's more than a halfway mark across horizontally really superimposes very nicely on the rule of thirds and takes it a little step further by giving us the real center of interest here in the tightest part of the spiral as it gets smaller and smaller to infinity. The rule of thirds is kind of doing the same thing as the golden section in its division of space and finding the ideal focal point in all that picture geography. Not all your pictures have to have the focal point at the golden section. That they can be more organic and unexpected and irregular than that. So you just zoom right up onto your gesture scribble, doing the same thing as Andrew Loomis was doing with his alphabet divisions. Use a viewfinder that you cut, maybe in a golden rectangle, and try it zooming in and zooming out of your little gesture scribble, and divide your picture space up that way. You were sort of organically designing anyway, composing when you came up with your 15-second gestural scribble sketch. So let that be your invisible grid. The art elements play into all of this. The way you divide up your picture space rests on how you play with these elements. And this is how to start to analyze your picture, and focusing on the elements of art and the principles of art, principles of design, will get you thinking more like a fine artist and less like a drawer or a cartoonist, maybe. Although I know the good cartoonists follow, unconsciously or not, all these same guidelines, elements, and principles. So the first one is shape. Diane very kindly sent me some notes from her class she took at Miami University, Laura Chapman's class. She had a different set of important 7 elements of design. So you'll find different versions of these lists. I'll stick tonight to the one that I know, but it's not the final word on the subject. People have been looking at this and studying these ideas for centuries, maybe thousands of years. Well, the first one, shape, is very important. There's a shape for you. There's the Mandelbrot set shape that happens on a computer when you put in Mandelbrot's formula, the fractal formula. But there's the cover of Lane Smith's book. Look, you can see the big shapes there. And when we talk about shape, we're not only talking about the positive, the positive space, but the negative shape as well, the background shape. When you do one, you're also setting up the other, and it is also a shape. So you're working in both directions. So Tony Couch says there are good shapes and bad shapes. So he says in his book, Watercolor, You Can Do It, sensational painting book, how-to book. You can see that a painting is a collection of shapes, he writes. This is true whether it be realistic, abstract, or non-objective art. Since a painter then is in the shape maker business, it would be a good idea to examine shapes. There are good shapes and bad ones. Let's look at the bad first. There are only 3, and they should be avoided like the plague. Anything that is or will fit into a square, a circle, or a triangle with any 2 sides of equal length. The reason they are to be avoided is that they have no variety of dimension and hence are boring. Don't want to be boring, because a painter is a shape maker, symbol collector, and entertainer. Since the picture is made up of shapes, we focus on shapes first, positive and negative. going back on those boring shapes, the square, for example, he says, has 4 sides of identical length and 4 identical angles in it. The offending triangle has at least 2 sides of identical length with 2 identical angles. That's an equilateral triangle. That's the one you want to avoid. And the poor circle has the same diameter no matter where it is measured, and the same degree of curve all over. So there's no variety there. So it's a bad shape. You want to avoid it. And I've got the wrong attribution on this graphic here. This is actually from Frank Webb's book. The title of his book is Webb on Watercolor, another wonderful watercolor painter. And he's demonstrating here this fist. The closed fist would be an example of a shape that falls in the shapes that are to be avoided, squares and rounds. The fist is sort of a round shape. It's in the middle of the space here. It is self-contained. It's boring. It's not interacting very well with the background. It's divided all the corners of the frame into sort of equal parts, so nothing interesting going on in any of those space divisions, and it's very predictable. It's just not integrated with anything in the rest of the picture. It's an island unto itself, so that's not a good shape. If you can stretch shapes so they are longer in one direction than the other, it makes it more interesting. This gives character and direction to a shape, and direction, we'll find out, is another one of the design elements. So we stretched it out. The slant shapes in relation to the picture's border, this not only initiates movement, Webb writes, but makes more exciting background shapes, negative shapes. So the diagonal does feel like movement. It's got tension in it because it's leaning, and it relates well. That thumb sticking out sets up a whole different triangle in this side of the picture than the triangle on this side of the picture. You see that the negative space is different, and it's also the positive shape is different because of this jutting form. Interlock positive shapes with other shapes or background shapes. So the one hand is interlocking with the other. This keeps the shape interesting. You can combine 2 shapes this way. Also sets up interesting negative spaces. The way you interlock a shape is by taking bites out of both shapes, and by sticking out projections along the edges of shapes, as in a jigsaw puzzle, 2 pieces fitting together. Here we're using the most telling silhouette to characterize a particular object. This even more so says hand than with the fingers all closed together. It's an easier silhouette to distinguish. I guess if it was the Vulcan greeting sign, you'd have the 2 fingers together and the space between the 2 fingers. That would not be quite as good because that's not as asymmetrical as this grouping of fingers in the palm. And then, of course, there's that wonderful thumb that does its own thing off to one side. So all the way around the hand, the sides are different. The configuration and interaction with the negative or background space is different. So look for telling silhouettes for your shape so that we can read that shape, know what it is right away. And then finally, Frank Webb has this demonstration of creating passage or linkage from one shape to another. Usually passages are created by deliberately overlapping a couple of objects, he writes, which ordinarily might not be overlapped from the viewer's position. So we've got 2 shapes. Together they equal one bigger shape, one bigger passage in your picture. Tony Couch points out, let's look at the good shapes. A good shape is one that is entertaining or interesting to see. And the more fascinating we can make it, the better off we are. It is best described as a bulky hunk of a shape as opposed to a long string or worm shape. And it's one that has 2 different dimensions. So it's longer than it is wide. So it's not a square, it's not a circle. And it has an oblique thrust. So that means there's an angle, and it has incidence and or interlocks at the edges all the way around the shape. 2 different dimensions means that the shape's height is greater than its width or vice versa. Being oblique or having an oblique thrust means the shape is either at an angle or appears to be at an angle. This angular appearance can be affected by making one end larger, smaller, higher, or lower than the other. The wisdom of making the shape oblique lies in the fact that horizontal or vertical lines or shapes are static, while those that are oblique are dynamic, have more tension, and thus more interesting. But don't make your oblique thrust run right off the paper so your viewer follows that diagonal all the way off the page. You want to interrupt that diagonal or find a way of obscuring it at some points. Don't use it to cut your paper into two pieces. Incidents at the edges are things protruding from the shape or space protruding into it, or both. Care should be taken to vary the height, depth, and width of these protrusions and the spaces between them. Interlock is a particular type of incident at the edge. This protrusion comes out of the shape at an angle and forms a hook that causes the shape to interlock with the space behind it, as we've described them here, particularly the incidents and interlocks at the edges. It's the difference between interesting shapes and those that are boring that distinguishes the work of competent painters and award winners from the also-ran. Don't want to be one of the also-rans. Yeah, so we're shape makers, symbols collectors, and entertainers. And how do we entertain in a picture? Well, we entertain by playing with the elements and the principles of design. Interesting collection, assortment of shapes by Divya Srinivasan, an animator who's also a children's book author, illustrator, Little Owl's Night. A shape can be just a piece of flat color. The next element of design is size. We see the difference in size here between the two subjects in the picture, the little mouse and the lion's face and mane. This is from Jerry Pinkney's Caldecott-winning wordless picture book, The Lion and the Mouse. He works in watercolor. You see the two sizes contrasted there, which give the picture all its meaning. Another example of size, the little girl and the big robot in Dan Santat's book, Oh No! And the beloved library lion, art by Kevin Hawkes. Big lion, little child, and small teacher. And they're small because they're further back in the space, but that still counts. That contrast between the shapes made it interesting. Line, here we go. This is Picasso's upside down Igor Stravinsky. Of course, Picasso didn't draw Stravinsky upside down, but Betty Edwards turned the sketch upside down for her great book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which is all about the power of contour drawing. Interesting example of line by Betsy Lewin in Doreen Cronin's book, Clickety Clack, Quackety Quack. You want something to dominate, either line or shape or color in a picture. And a lot of times, even though there's color in an illustrated spread, it's the line that's really the expressive element, then really telling the story. Of course, she's also delineating shapes with her lines, isn't she? Kathy, please stay on as long as you like or are able to, but I don't want to hold you prisoner, but it'd be great to have you with me if you want to. And
okay,
if you do stay, feel free to chime in, okay? And anybody else, if you'd like to get on and join us, I have posted that Hangout link up toward the top of the text chat. Okay, so where were we? Line. Look at that interesting brush line on those sheeps. More cool line work on the sheeps. So line is its own little expressive element, and it can be so powerful, and sometimes it's all you need with a little wash for your illustrations. And very commonly it's relied on in children's book illustrations. There's another kind of line. Archie Preston from one of Eileen Spinelli. Not all lines have to be overtly expressed. They can be implied, and this graphic shows that. Fine artists know this and use it all the time. Okay, so we got shape, size, line, direction. Really important in children's picture books. Right? There's a photograph I took in Fredericksburg of a Christmas tower. And obviously it was much taller than this. It's a vertical thrust, right? So our eye is acknowledging that it is an up and down design element. Very important in picture books because the reader is moving from page spread to page spread. The page turn is an implied, very pointed, left to right movement as you go to that page turn. This direction on this spread in Marla Frazee's picture is a diagonal down. Can you see it? Diagonal direction. Horizontal direction. We're following the fish in John Klassen's great book, This Is Not My Hat. Boy, are we watching that fish in that picture book as we go from page turn to page turn. Direction. Picture books really rely on direction as one of the key design elements. Texture is also important in visual art. Another element. We got wood and dirt and sky. They all have their texture that we can see in the way the light interacts with them in the photograph, right? And the way we draw details and subject matter it conveys texture. Those are hard edge rocks, right? In watercolor, there's not that many ways to show texture, but you've got a flat wash on the left. You've got a dry brushing in the middle, and then you've got wet into wet technique on the right. Those are all three great examples of texture you can use for your expression, visual expression. Value is another key element. That's from a watercolor class I teach at the art school here at Laguna Gloria. And those are monochromatic studies. There's a student working on one of those monochromatic studies. Here's Peter Brown's Creepy Carrots, and he's using value as his maybe most outstanding design element to that contrast, those silhouettes against a backlit pantry. It really helps us to see this picture from 30, 40, 50 feet away. A teacher reading the picture book to the class and holding up the book and showing pictures. You've got to have a strong value pattern in those spreads so the kids sitting on the floor uncomfortably can tell from 20 feet what's going on, right? Leonard Everett Fisher, who designed, hundreds of educational books for the education market as well as trade books. A lot of his pictures were monochromatic, and he relied on value. And you just look at the texture there too, to make the pictures read. Contrast and value in John Rocco's book, Blackout. I won't take time to walk through all the pieces of this slide, but you can see this is the same image repeated with different value pronouncements, different values. Light, mid-tone, and dark values are taken up by different parts of the picture, different layers of the picture. They remind me of like stage flats in a puppet show or a real stage play where you've got the flat in the front has got one value, it's light, and the one behind it is a little darker, and then you go back and there's a dark black curtain drop for the dark value, and you change those pieces around. You guys know all this. I'm sure you've heard this in a million classes, But we often forget, and a lot of the work that's turned in Guest Group Antiques, nobody's thinking about the value pattern, the underlying value structure. So we've got to learn to make our darks with our paints as well as the light and mid-tone colors, right? Different value configurations there, same scene. Looks like a whole different picture with the different value structure on it. And watercolor painters, of course, do little value sketches off to the side, little bitty things, posted, credit card size value sketches first, because they know the value pattern is going to be more important than anything they do with color in the picture. Color is almost it's like flavoring, but it's not structure. It's not really contributing to the design, to the clarity as much as value is. These are value charcoal and pencil sketches by John Pike, who was another famous old school watercolor painter. They do these before they start the painting, and then they know how bold and dark and intense they want to go when they're painting. They're not guessing. They figured it all out with their charcoal first. Maybe not as important as value, but it's still great. It's something we really are drawn to in picture books, right? Here's an example of a contrast, two complementary colors making up the color in this. But he worked out the value pattern first, right? So there they are. Art elements, shape, size, lines, direction, texture, value, color. And I know there are different versions of this list out there, but this is one you can think about. And when you're putting an illustration together, it helps to be conscious of what you're doing with these things. This is the alphabet you're working with. It's a very simple alphabet. It's got 7 letters in it, and this is the world of your expression is created by these letters. Kathy, you have anything to add to that? Any thoughts? Did you learn this in 7th grade too?
Well, I learned this in college.
In college, yeah, that counts. Was it clear then?
I think one of these was swapped out for space in college because it was it encompassed more than two-dimensional art.
Yeah.
So they want you to also think about space a lot of times when you're.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in 2D art, we'll lump space into shape, okay? Because you'll convey it in some way, either through perspective drawing. Well, actually, you could convey it with lines too, and size. Yeah, all those.
Yeah, but I think direction is something that's not often talked about in a lot of art programs, just because that's just part of, that's like saying composition, but when you're, like you said, with the illustrations, you really do need to have like the want to go on to the next page. Whereas like a painting is like they want you to stay right there in the composition.
Great point. If elements are the letters of the alphabet, principles are the grammar, the syntax, and together these make up the language of art. Okay. So what are the principles? How do you use these? And every one of these principles is applied to an element. Each of the elements can have this going on and should have this going on. If your picture is not quite working, it's because one of your design elements doesn't have this going on. So here's dominance, maybe the most important one. You want dominant shape. It's Don Tate's. I didn't give Don Tate credit on this. Well, I guess because his name is on the cover. He wrote and illustrated this book. But he's got this big dominant shape in the. Another big dominant shape with a cool color tone, a dominant coolness and colors going on by David Weisner in his Caldecott medal winning book Tuesday. dominant shape, dominant color in Barbara Cooney's exquisite illustrations. Unity. Unity means if I were to take Kathy's piece and tear it up in little pieces and throw it in with a bunch of other torn up illustrations from other artists and scramble them all like a lottery draw, and then I asked you to pick out the pieces of Kathy's illustration, because Kathy has such unity in her style and in her approach and the way she uses the art elements, you could pick out the pieces. You may not be able to assemble the piece perfectly as a puzzle, but you'd know which pieces go with Kathy's illustration because of the unity she's imbued the piece with. There's unity. This is Stephanie Gregan. Unity in color, unity in shapes. You know, we keep seeing these trees. They're not all the same, but that's a repeated motif in there. Unity in texture. This one strikes me as unity in the way the line, say, I know this is Archie Preston's line work. Unity in line. Contrast is critically important as a principle. It makes things read across the room, right? We see it in photography, we see it in music, we see it in writing. Contrast is everything, right? The tension between two opposing things, two conflicting things. But one of those things has to have the upper hand, or there's no dominance. If we have two equal pieces contrasting with each other, then we don't have dominance and the design falls apart. So we need dominance, but we also need contrast. Dominance is the monolithic nature of something, the foundation, but it needs a little something to challenge that, right? And that's where the conflict comes in. Conflict is contrast. It's variety. Unity plus variety equals design. And contrast is another way of looking at that word variety. Harmony is kind of on the other end of the scale. It's things that are similar. In this illustration by Emily Arnold McCulley, another Caldecott Medal winner, we've got harmony in these blues and greens. But we got a little contrast there too with the red across the opposite side of the color wheel. Harmony in these shapes, these figures of the kids. They're not all exactly the same. They're all a little different, but they're kind of the same. That similarity gives the whole picture of harmony, as well as direction, good line. The harmony is also in the colors used. A lot of the elements have a harmonious treatment. You can see that. I picked this one, Brian Selznick's. You know, these little images that Brian Selznick does, the originals are not much bigger than, they're like about, I don't know, 5 by 7 inches. They're tiny little things. Pencil sketches all. This is from Hugo Cabret. Harmony in texture and line treatment, value. You can see the harmony and the unity kind of in this picture. There's a sameness to it throughout, with all these nice bright spots as well for the contrast. So imagine an axis line going down the middle of the picture, a central axis, and the balance has to kind of equivocate on either side, unless you've got a really good reason for violating that. And in storytelling, you often do, can violate it. But in terms of sheer 2D art, balance is an important principle. These two big heavy shapes sort of counterweight each other. Here's from Creative Illustration by Andrew Loomis, again, the wonderful Andrew Loomis. He talks about the fulcrum lever principle applied to composition, and you might have heard this before. This is what N.C. Wyeth was doing with the knights, right? He's got these two heavy masses. Rule: the heavier the mass or weight, the nearer it should be placed to the middle of your picture, the middle line of your picture. So if you got something real heavy, it threatens to tip the balance, tip the scales of objects in your picture. You move that big element toward the center. And that applies to something very dark, because dark implies weight. Here's Tony Couch demonstrating the same kind of thing with the teeter-totter. The big heavy parent has to move closer to the fulcrum of the teeter-totter to sort of balance the weight of the little kid. And he did it here by moving his focal point, the house, a little closer to the center, and putting some big dark mass, and then countering all this weight on the slightly left-hand side with these trees over here on the right. The A version is wrong. The B is fixed. These C version pictures are not successful because they're a little too similar in size, and so we see a center line right down the middle of them, and we lose that all-important asymmetry. And here, when he bunches them all together to try to fix it, he does it right in the middle of the picture, and we lose the asymmetry as well. So here it's better. He's got the dark tree and the house. All this interest is countered by the heavy dark of the sky in the top right-hand quadrant. So all illustrating the idea of balance. Gradation is movement, and you can see Peter McCarthy doing this with these beautiful lines, beautiful value gradations in the T-Rex, in this very funny book, how he moves softly from the lightest value to the darkest shadows. But he does it gradually, and a lot of visual art is just about change. You want to make sure you've got change going on all over your picture, with the most dramatic contrasty change happening at the focal point, the part where you really want your viewer to look. That's where the contrast is. But the change needs to be addressed in there. A work of visual art, a composition, is a kind of a symphony of changes happening. And gradation is this very gradual change. Here it is with Peter Brown, same kind of thing. He's got sharp contrast, and then he's got these gradations happening in the value. Here's Divya is creating a gradation from the cool dark of the top of the sky, zenith of the sky, down to the warm colors, the yellow. So there's a gradation in color. Alternation. This is a spread from, this is not my hat, this is underwater flora. This repetition going on, but it's alternating, and you see alternating shapes a lot, alternating values, alternating patterns a lot in things like fabric design, wallpaper, things in the man-made environment, deliberate. It's very contrived. But repetition with variation is a more natural design element that we see all the time. And illustrators use it all the time. So there are repeating shapes. You're really not supposed to repeat a lot of shapes unless you change something in the element you're repeating. And Emily Arnold McCulley did this these were end papers for the Bobbin Girl, her picture book, and landscape painters use it too. The middle drawing is an example of alternation, which is one kind of repetition. See the skinny tree, fat tree, 3 skinny trees, fat tree, 3 skinny trees, fat tree. It's kind of a rhythm, but it's a very artificial rhythm, and that's alternation, which is okay. And the one on the top is repetition with variation. So we see these vertical tree shapes, but they're all different. There's not one of them alike, and this is something we should strive for. The rocks are different. One has a vertical thrust, one has a horizontal thrust, from the other one. And some of the trees are spiky and linear, and some of them are conifers that are a whole different kind of shape and texture. So that they are repeated shapes. The one at the bottom is the one we want to avoid. That's just dull sameness, right? It's Look at those repeated. They're the space between them is the same. The trees are basically the same, and that's the kind of repetition we don't want. So we want to be very particular about the repetition we're doing in our pictures. And it's hard to do because we tend to want to repeat everything the same brush strokes. We have the brush strokes. We do one right after the other one. The repetitions are often right next to each other because we just did the other one. We just want to repeat and be like a machine. And so you have to kind of consciously not be that not be that machine. Remind yourself that you're a creative, designing person who doesn't repeat himself, herself. There they are, the design principles: dominance, hierarchy, authority, sole proprietorship. Unity is this relatedness, oneness, sameness, contrast, variety, diversity, tension, opposite. Contrast is big. Harmony, balance, gradation is the gradual change. Alternation, repeated series of patterns. But more likely, more often we'll be doing the repetition with variation, which is the rhythm. And look, when we're thinking about shapes and consciously telling ourselves we're putting shapes into our sketch, we also should be thinking at the same time about all the principles. I mean, it's kind of like a centipede thinking, how is he going to take that next step? Too much going on. But if your picture's not working or your initial sketch isn't working, then go in and look at it in terms of how you're relating the principles to each of the elements. Same thing for size, the lines you're using, how you're playing with these design elements using the ideas and the principles is so much more important than the subject matter of your picture or how well it's painted or drawn. Texture, same thing. Yes, it's so important. Same principles apply. My wife and I were looking at the properties of matter because she was teaching her second graders about the properties of matter in chemistry. And you know, they sound so much like design elements. Mass, color. These are what scientists use to evaluate different. They look at mass, color, shape, volume, density, opacity or viscosity, which I guess is another way. You could argue that it's another way of saying texture. So I thought that was fun. There were some interesting observations by Tony Couch in Watercolor You Can Do It. He talks about the 8 principles of design, and he says, although they're called the 8 principles of design, they are really 8 principles of human nature, or 8 basic ways in which we are exactly the same. For example, there's the principle of repetition with variation. Do we not like variety? Don't we call it the spice of life? Aren't we bored with an ever-changing daily routine? Another principle is contrast, conflict. Almost everyone at some time has been stalled in traffic for seemingly hours while an accident ahead is cleared. How often have you finally arrived at the accident only to find that it occurred in the lanes going in the opposite direction? You know what's caused that jam in your lane? Because traffic resumes speed as soon as you pass it. Why does everyone slow down to look at an accident? Because that's conflict over there. No one can resist looking at it, even though, in the case of an auto accident, we may be afraid of what we see, but it's still interesting. Would you like to see a terrible accident every morning on your way to work? Certainly not. In fact, that sort of thing could affect one's mental stability. So from this, we learn that conflict is interesting to us, but only in small doses. We design the same way. A painting must have a color dominance, for instance, but it also needs a small amount of conflicting color to provide interest. Not a great deal. Too much is disturbing and will destroy the dominance. How about this important principle of dominance? Can you think of any successful organization anywhere in the world at any time in history that was not led by one dominant figure? Every ship has only one captain. There are several mates, but only one captain oversees the operation of the ship and is responsible for it. Every corporation or company, no matter its size, has only one president. There are several vice presidents and assistant VPs by the score, but all answer to one president who runs the company. Do you think you don't operate that way? Imagine your car with 2 steering wheels. And he goes on. He says, why? Because that's the way we are. We don't function efficiently without one dominant figure at the top. We paint the same way. In order for the viewer to be comfortable with your painting, it must have one dominant shape, one dominant value, and so on. You probably realize by now that as Ed Whitney, and he was a famous watercolor painter of an earlier generation, as Ed Whitney said, you can ignore the principles of design, but they won't ignore you. You can't get away with ignorance of these principles because the design errors in your paintings will tell the tale. Just as we all admire knowledge, we disdain ignorance. Fads in art come and go, but the design principles remain the same for the same reason that cultures come and go, while human nature remains the same. Even those who know nothing of design will be less comfortable with the painting of inferior design because less of it appeals to that human nature that is inherent to everyone all around the world. We all respond the same way to these things. So that's Tony Couch. Do you want to pick out the element that catches your eye first and how the element might be being treated according to the principles? We'll try a couple of these. I know it's a little awkward with the time lag in the stream, but let's see if we can try one or two. Any thoughts about what's the standout design element here? Maybe color? Maybe shapes? And if it's shapes, what's the principle at work? Maybe repetition with variation? Here's from Eric Roman. Shape? So the element would be shape. The first element we see is shape, but we see it because of the contrast, right? Got a strong line. Look at the illustrations. Take yourself away from the storytelling for a minute and look at them strictly in an abstract way and say, have I got legitimate play going on with the design elements and principles? It's not about what's happening in the picture. And it's tough for illustration because illustrating is, we're always trying to convey the message, convey the story, convey the characters, and we're giving short shrift to those timeless, universal elements and principles of design, the language of art. What about this one? Shapes? Contrast. Yeah, Sherilyn got the last one. Yes, thank you, Maya. 2 kids in the center. What about this one? By Juana Martinez Neal. What element leaps to mind first are catching your eye, and then what do you see going on in terms of how that element is playing with principles of design? Direction, very good. What's interesting is that we got a counter direction with this gal up here making us look this way to the left, while the row of the kids with the mattresses, bringing the mattresses to the princess, they're going to the right. So we've got punch, counter punch happening in direction. Christine says shapes, direction, and variety. Yeah. Certainly a variety in the shapes and a variety in the direction too. Look at that cat up there. What a funny shape. When you're drawing figures, think of them first as silhouettes and shapes, and then think about their characterizations, because the shape is more important because it's a design element. And then think about what you're going to do with that shape. How are you going to manipulate that shape and make it relate to the rest of the composition? Terry Widener, wonderful painter who lives in the Fort Worth area. David Walker's art here. Line jumps out at me in this one. But then, of course, there's also the color and the shape and, of course, direction. A little bit of texture going on with the kicked up dust. And then I could go down the list of how each of those elements is playing with design principle. Forget about the wonderful characterizations of the children here and look at it in terms of abstract design. I think the first element I see is color. And then I see a variety. I see contrast in the color. And then value. Squint your eyes and look at the picture. Value with lots of contrast. Value, good value. Yeah. Yeah, good illustrations have them all. And they don't have to be real involved, gorgeous paintings either. They can be symbols of things. You know, you don't have to say a lot to be addressing the language of art. And you can do it very simply. You don't have to paint like E.B. Lewis. He's one of a kind. How about Daniel Minter's beautiful work for Donna Janelle Bowman's Step Right Up, about a horse that supposedly could count. Because of the woodblock flavor of this illustration, I was real conscious of line. But you can see the golden section right here where the dresser goes just a little more than half horizontally across the picture. Line, contrast, thanks, Charlene. Mark Teague's wonderful art, monochromatic scene with a little bit of color over here in the top right. I could go on and on with these. I'm not sure it's fair to you to be doing it for so long, but when you start picking up picture books to look at the artwork, think about these new things. Analyze in terms of the universal principles of design. Take them one by one and see what the artist is doing, and then apply it to your own work. Those illustrators were so intent on telling the story and creating the scene and the drama that we forget about the invisible part. So this beautiful scene by Emily Arnold McCulley would not, if she hadn't thought about the language of art, it wouldn't have been nearly effective, even if she'd captured a good little girl character and had, you know, the right mood. Brian Floca, Caldecott Medal winning illustrator. And the first thing that came to mind on this was direction. It's got a great diagonal in here, right? And then lines. Not a whole lot of contrast in the value. It's kind of a general midtone, but a little contrast in color. Monochromatic with a note of color for variety. Texture, maybe? You get the idea, I think. We could do this all night, couldn't we? Look how much direction plays a part in picture book illustrations. This is Marla Frazee again. Victo Nye illustrated Chris Barton's book about World War I dreadnoughts that were camouflaged. Interesting subject for a children's picture book. Just shows to go you that anything can be a picture book, any kind of subject matter, if treated the right way. It's how you do it. Look at all those repeated shapes. Eric Roman again. The overlooked component of often of children's book illustration, particularly by beginners and aspirants. And we all have been real patient tonight. January 9th, Wednesday at 7 p.m. Let's have another hangout, and this time I'd love to see some of your pieces or beginning pieces or sketch for planned pieces that incorporate the language of art above all. And so cute characters are great. Good drawing is great, but more important are these elements and principles, and see if you can start incorporating them in a conscious way into the spreads you're turning in. I will send you a folder link to upload your pieces to. January 9th, we'll look at the pieces, and I'll send you a more coherent verbal description of what this assignment is. It can be final art or a sketch or even a thumbnail, but you can see now we've got a whole nother dimension to think about in our children's book illustration. A couple weeks you'll get an email from me about our guest instructor. For those of you in guest group critiques, our guest instructor for January, that'll be later in the month in January. Back to the drawing board. Happy holidays to all, Judith says. Yes, I'm glad that was helpful. Happy holidays, guys. I will see you after the holidays, after the new year, and we'll just explore design for one more session. Good night, everyone.